Disgusting, his father's voice cut through the chapel like shattered glass. How dare you show your face here? At his own wedding. His own father. The guests froze, forks suspended midair, whispers dying in throats. The scar that stretched from cheekbone to jaw seemed to burn all over again. Not from fire this time, but from shame. He'd survived Afghanistan, pulled men from flames, earned medals pinned to his chest by generals. Yet here, in front of everyone he loved, his father stood like a prosecutor delivering a verdict. The room held its breath. Then a chair scraped at the head table. A Navy SEAL rose trembling, eyes locked on those scars. And the truth that had waited years in silence was about to shatter everything. The morning light filtered through stained glass, painting the chapel floor in colours that should have felt like blessing. But the first thing Marcus heard wasn't the music. It was the whisper, sliding between the wooden pews like smoke. His face, someone murmured, the words barely audible but sharp enough to pierce skin. He kept his eyes fixed on the centre aisle, on the altar where Emily waited. Her hands were folded, calm and steady, the way she always held herself when she knew he needed an anchor. He'd learned to breathe the way the rehabilitation nurse taught him during those long months of recovery. In through the nose, slow and measured. Out through the mouth, releasing what wanted to choke him. The chapel smelled of lilies and floor polish, scents that should have been comforting but instead reminded him how exposed he was. The scar started at his left cheekbone and carved a path down to his jaw, a river of damaged tissue that had become as much a part of his identity as his name. Under soft light, it was pale, almost ghostly. Under the hard glare of chandelier bulbs, it flared angry and red, demanding attention. He'd learned to live with that flare, with the way children stared openly and adults pretended not to see while their eyes betrayed them. At his own wedding, he'd believed love would speak louder than skin, that vows would drown out judgment. Then his father stood. Not to welcome him, not to offer a blessing or even a reluctant nod. He stood the way a prosecutor rises to deliver an accusation, shoulders squared, face twisted with something that looked like disgust but felt like betrayal. Disgusting, the word fell heavy, deliberate. His father's voice carried across the chapel with the kind of authority that demanded attention. How dare you show your face here? A fork clattered against tile. Someone's laugh died strangled in their throat. The room seemed to tilt, gravity pulling everything toward that single moment of cruelty. Marcus kept his eyes down, staring at the glossy wood beneath his polished shoes, watching the way light rippled across the grain. He'd learned that trick years ago. If you don't meet their eyes, maybe the shame won't take root quite so deep. But shame is a fast, hot thing. It moves quicker than reason, quicker than the defenses you've spent years building. It finds the cracks and floods in. The officiant hesitated, his hand frozen on the worn leather of his prayer book, unsure whether to continue or wait for someone else to take control. The guests leaned forward the way people lean toward heat, drawn to the spectacle of pain. Even the DJ paused, finger hovering above a button, afraid to add music to a moment that had become its own terrible symphony. Emily took one small step toward Marcus, moving the way you approach someone standing too close to the edge of a cliff. Her eyes asked a silent question. Do you want to leave? Should we run? He didn't answer. Couldn't answer. His throat had closed around words that had nowhere to go. Then a chair scraped at the head table. It wasn't loud, but the sound sliced through the tension like a blade. A man rose slowly, as if reconciling himself with gravity after years of carrying invisible weight. He wore dress whites, the uniform crisp and formal, ribbons arranged in neat rows across his chest. His shoulders were broad, carved from something stronger than ordinary flesh, the kind of posture that comes from years of discipline and duty. The room recognized the bearing before they recognized the man, a warrior's habit of standing straight even when the world has bent him in every other way. A Navy SEAL. He didn't reach for his glass, didn't clear his throat or call for attention. He simply stood and stared at Marcus with an intensity that felt like being seen for the first time in years. Not at the tuxedo carefully pressed and borrowed from a friend. Not at Emily glowing in white beside him. He stared at Marcus. At the scar. His face went pale, not the theatrical shock of someone pretending surprise, but the real bone-deep recognition that steals breath and steadies knees. His lower lip trembled once like a bridge settling under sudden weight. He swallowed hard, Adam's apple bobbing. The others at the head table, retirees with quiet medals and memories of their own wars, turned to him with small frowns, questioning. He drew a breath that seemed to fill every corner of the chapel, from the vaulted ceiling to the back pew where late arrivals stood crowded together. I know those scars. Silence arrived in circles. First, the front row stopped breathing. Then the middle rows caught it, passed it back like a contagion of stillness. Even the bartenders at the reception table felt it coil around their wrists, holding them motionless. Marcus's father stayed standing, fists clenched at his sides, visibly offended that the spotlight had moved without his permission, that someone else had dared to speak when he'd claimed the stage. The seal kept his eyes on Marcus, pupils narrowing and widening as if tracking a memory that lived somewhere between flesh and history. Marcus knew that look. He'd seen it in mirrors on bad nights. The look men wear when they smell diesel and dust that aren't there anymore, when the past refuses to stay buried. His heart made the same sound it had made the day the Humvee burned. An internal knocking, rhythmic and urgent, like a mechanic trapped under a hood trying to signal for help. Afghanistan is never truly over. It doesn't end when you board the transport home or when doctors clear you for discharge. It relocates, settles into your bones, makes a home in the spaces between heartbeats. It had taken Marcus years to teach his body that he wasn't still burning, that the heat was memory, not reality. One sentence had moved the flames closer again, made them real in a way that therapy and medication never quite managed to extinguish. Marcus felt Emily's fingers at his elbow, light as a bird landing on a branch. She didn't pull. She didn't insist. She simply reminded him she was there, steady and unchanging. The officiant lowered his book slowly, his expression shifting from confusion to something approaching awe. The seal took one step forward, dress shoes clicking against hardwood. Marcus's father opened his mouth to say another word edged with cruelty, but it broke apart before fully forming. The room was listening to someone else now. The seal's mouth opened and closed once, rehearsing courage in real time. He turned his head a fraction, as if checking to make sure he was really doing this, then faced Marcus again. His voice, when it came, was softer, weighted with cost. I know those scars, he repeated, each word measured, because I carry them, just not where you can see. He touched his chest, hand trembling against the white fabric of his uniform. He saved me. A ripple moved through the guests, visible and electric. People began to assemble a story from fragments. Burn, war, son, father, vows. Truth was rearranging the furniture of assumptions, forcing everyone to see the room differently. Marcus hadn't cried when he first woke to find the skin that would be his for the rest of his life. He hadn't cried when children pointed in grocery stores or when strangers crossed the street to avoid him. He hadn't cried when well-meaning people called him brave for simply existing, for buying milk or mowing his lawn. But he felt tears then, hot and insistent behind his eyes. Not for himself, not even for the man who stood trembling at the head table, but for the mercy of being seen by someone who spoke the same language his scars did, who understood without needing explanation. The seal placed both palms flat on the white linen tablecloth as if steadying not just the table but the entire room. He said Marcus's name like a prayer he'd been saving for exactly this moment, a benediction held in reserve for when it would matter most. No one breathed. The air itself seemed to hold still, afraid to disturb what was unfolding. The DJ lowered his hand from the controls. The officiant bowed his head as if in the presence of something sacred. Emily's thumb traced one small circle near Marcus's sleeve, an anchor felt only by him. A reminder that love was still here, even when shame tried to claim all the space. The room had narrowed to a triangle of truth. The man who made him. The man he pulled from fire. And Marcus himself standing between them, forced to choose which story would define him as he walked the rest of the aisle toward his future. He straightened his shoulders, lifted his head. A sky flashed across his mind, too bright, too hot. The kind of desert blue that feels like it's pressing down on you. He heard a voice yelling over the crack of small arms fire. The metallic smell of blood and burning that could have been pennies in a furnace. The present threaded itself through the past like a needle pulling stitches tight, closing wounds that had never quite healed. The seal drew a long breath. The guests waited as if for a verdict in a trial they hadn't known they were witnessing. Marcus's father opened his mouth, trying to reclaim control of the room he'd hijacked. He didn't get the chance. The seal stepped away from the head table, boots sounding deliberate and measured against the polished wood floor. He faced the crowd, looking past Marcus's father and into the eyes of everyone who had watched Marcus shrink under those cruel words. "You want a reason?" His voice was steady now, no longer trembling. "I'll give you one." He lifted a shaking hand and pointed, not at Marcus, but at something only the two of them could see. A memory made visible by force of will. "I was there." The words struck like ice water thrown in faces. Some guests sat down without meaning to, knees giving out. The bartender set down a glass with exaggerated care. Marcus's father's jaw worked, chewing words he couldn't quite form. He looked smaller suddenly and angrier at the same time, like a storm that had lost its heat but not its noise. The seal's shoulders squared. Marcus felt his own breath settle, not because the insult had vanished, but because truth had entered the room and asked him to stand with it. The scar tugged the way it always did when he smiled, tissue pulling against itself. He didn't smile. Not yet, but he met the seal's eyes and nodded once, a gesture of recognition that passed between them like a shared language. The seal nodded back. The officiant closed his prayer book, then opened it again, uncertain. Emily's hand tightened around Marcus's. The room leaned forward, every person straining to hear what would come next. The music was silent. The past and the present stood shoulder to shoulder, demanding to be witnessed. Then the seal began to speak, and the story Marcus had carried alone for so long became something shared, something witnessed, something that would change how everyone in that chapel understood the meaning of scars. Marcus grew up in a small house with hedges trimmed to military precision, an American flag displayed on the front porch, and a father who measured everything in inches and insults. His father believed discipline made men the way heat forges steel, and ridicule was the sharpest tool in his belt, the one he reached for most often. If Marcus brought home an A, his father wanted to know why it wasn't higher, why he'd allowed even 1 point to slip away. If Marcus struck out during Little League, his father told the other parents loud enough for everyone to hear that he'd never seen such clumsy hands on a boy. Laughter followed Marcus home like a second shadow, one that stretched longer than his own. His mother tried to soften the blows. She patched scraped knees with gentle hands, whispered that he was enough exactly as he was, left notes on his pillow when his father had been especially cruel. But his father's voice always carried louder, echoing through the house and lodging itself in the soft parts of Marcus's mind where doubts lived and grew. "Weakness is contagious," his father said more than once, usually at the dinner table, always in front of Marcus. It wasn't instruction. It was diagnosis, as if he'd examined his son and found him fundamentally flawed. Marcus learned early to stay quiet and work harder, hoping that someday, somehow, he'd make his father proud. That maybe if he just tried hard enough, pushed far enough, the man would finally see him as worthy. When Marcus was 16, he watched towers fall on television. Smoke and ash and people running through streets turned grey with destruction. His father called it tragic, a national shame. Marcus, watching the footage loop over and over, said he wanted to serve, to give back, to be part of something that mattered. His father sneered. "You? They'll chew you up and spit you out. Better men than you will be broken." He spoke like he was reading an inevitable future, one already written and unchangeable. Marcus took it as a dare. The day he signed enlistment papers at the recruiter's office, fluorescent lights buzzing overhead and the smell of old coffee in the air. His father didn't come. Didn't shake his hand or offer a word of encouragement. He only said, voice flat and final, "Don't come back crying." But there was pride in Marcus's chest he couldn't quite describe or explain. He was joining something larger than himself, larger than his father's disappointment. A cause. A country. A brotherhood. He thought maybe when his father saw him in uniform, standing tall with the bearing of a soldier, he'd finally see the son he wanted. Basic training didn't break Marcus. It clarified him, stripped away everything unnecessary and revealed what was underneath. He learned to run on blisters that wept and bled through his socks. He learned to march on no sleep, eyes gritty and burning. He learned to carry more weight than seemed possible. Packs that made his shoulders scream and his back threaten to buckle. In the sandpits, face down and counting out push-ups until his arms shook. He remembered his father's words. Weakness is contagious. He used them as fuel. Proof that he could be stronger than expected. He wanted to prove his father wrong. Letters came from his mother, sweet and encouraging, full of prayers and reminders that she loved him. From his father, there was nothing. Marcus sent a photo anyway, himself in uniform, standing at attention, hoping the image might speak louder than his words ever had. Weeks later, he got a reply. 3 words scrawled across a postcard. "Don't embarrass us." Marcus carried that note with him overseas, folded in his pocket like a talisman of everything he was trying to outrun. Afghanistan was not what the movies had promised. There was dust, endless and invasive, more than glory. There was waiting, tense and exhausting, more than fighting. But the waiting was sharp-edged, dangerous in its own way. Marcus was 20 years old, holding a rifle in villages where children played soccer with balls made from rags and tape. Sometimes they smiled and waved. Sometimes they glared with ancient suspicion. Sometimes they warned with their eyes. And the soldiers learned to listen to what wasn't said. In phone calls home, routed through connections that crackled and delayed his words by half a second, his mother asked if he was safe. He said yes, though the sound of mortars in the distance made the line hum with interference. His father rarely came to the phone. Once, when he did, he asked if Marcus had gained weight. "Don't let yourself go soft," he said, then hung up without waiting for a response. Marcus told himself he didn't need his father's approval. He had brothers in the platoon who shared water without asking, shared silence without judgment, shared fear without mockery. Still, at night, staring up at desert stars that seemed close enough to touch, he wished for something different. A father proud enough to tell people where his son was serving. Instead, Marcus had become a secret, something his father didn't mention at church or to neighbors who asked. Before Afghanistan, Marcus's scar was invisible, the one left by a father who never thought he was enough. He thought war might change that calculation, that if he came home with medals or at least with the grit and bearing of service, his father would finally see. But the man's disdain was steady as gravity, pulling everything down no matter how high Marcus climbed. Yet inside him something steadier was building. A belief that honor didn't come from his father's approval, but from how he carried himself under fire, from who he chose to be when no one was watching. That seed had been planted long before flames touched his skin. It would bloom later in ways none of them could imagine. But back then, in the dust and heat of Afghanistan, it was just a quiet resolve, a small defiance against the voice that said he'd never be good enough. What Marcus didn't know was that the choice to serve would cost him more than distance from his father. It would brand him in ways his father would use against him for the rest of his life. The scar that made him sneer, that made strangers look away, started here. Long before flames, long before the Humvee, it began in his father's words, words that followed him across oceans, into deserts, and eventually back to a wedding aisle where that same voice would try to shrink him one more time. Afghanistan has a way of tattooing itself onto you. Not just on skin, but deep inside where bone meets memory. Marcus thought he'd known war from movies and news coverage, from the carefully edited images that made it look dramatic and clear-cut. But nothing prepares you for the taste of dust in your mouth every single morning, gritty and metallic. Nothing prepares you for the constant hum of helicopters, a sound that becomes the soundtrack of your existence. Nothing prepares you for the way silence itself becomes suspicious, a warning that something is about to break. Marcus was 23 when the desert branded him forever. Their convoy had been on what they called routine patrol, though there's no such thing in a war zone. 6 Humvees rolling down a stretch of road near Kandahar. The kind of route they'd driven so often it felt like a treadmill going nowhere. Familiarity breeds carelessness, and they should have known better. They all should have. Marcus remembered laughing with Torres, one of the guys in his unit, about how much sand could fit inside a single boot. They were mid-joke, Torres grinning and shaking his head when the blast came. Noise first, so loud it felt like a physical blow, like being punched in the chest by sound itself. Then light, impossibly bright, whiter than the desert sun. Then heat, rising in a wave that made the air shimmer and buckle. Marcus remembered his ears ringing so loudly he thought he'd gone permanently deaf, the world reduced to a high-pitched whine. Then came the smells. Sharp, wet, unmistakable. Diesel and blood and fire all braided together in a stench that would haunt him for years. The Humvee in front of them was swallowed whole. One second it was there, solid and real. The next it was a torch, flames climbing and twisting, consuming metal and rubber and flesh with equal hunger. Marcus saw movement inside, someone pounding against the window, screaming words he couldn't hear but could feel in his chest. Muffled by fire and terror, his body moved before thought could catch up. Training does that, or maybe it's something deeper. Stupidity or courage or some combination that makes a man run toward the thing that will kill him. He ran. The heat was immediate, searing, like stepping into an oven set to maximum. He tore open the back hatch, smoke clawing down his throat and into his lungs. Inside was chaos given form. One man was slumped unconscious, head lolling. Another was screaming, his leg caught in twisted metal, flames curling around the seatbelts and melting fabric into flesh. Marcus pulled. He pulled with everything he had, muscles screaming, tendon threatening to snap. His gloves fused to the hot metal buckle. The smell of burning skin rose thick and nauseating, and he realized it wasn't just theirs anymore. It was his. Somehow, through adrenaline and desperation and something that felt like divine intervention, they made it out. Marcus dragged one man, then rolled back for another, hauling them into dirt that felt cool only by comparison. He patted at flames with his own arms, slapping at fire that didn't want to die. His sleeve caught. He remembered Torres throwing his jacket over him, cursing steadily as he beat at flames with bare hands. His face took the worst of it. When heat licks at cloth and skin, you don't feel pain right away. There's a strange distance, like your body has walked 2 steps behind itself and is watching from a safe remove, detached and clinical. Then the pain crashes in like a tide. Overwhelming. All-consuming. Marcus didn't remember blacking out, but he must have. He woke in the back of a medevac helicopter, a medic leaning over him, shouting words he couldn't pass through the ringing and the shock. His world had shrunk to bandages, morphine that made everything soft-edged and distant, and the hiss of oxygen through a mask. Days blurred into weeks in a military hospital. He learned new words: grafts, débridement, rehabilitation. Technical terms for pain given shape and schedule. He stared at ceilings, counting tiles, avoiding mirrors with a determination that bordered on obsession. When they finally let him see, it was in a bathroom the size of a closet, fluorescent lights buzzing and flickering overhead. The nurse handed him a mirror, her eyes kind but braced for his reaction. Marcus lifted it slowly. The man staring back had half a face he recognized and half he didn't. Skin warped and shiny, pulled tight in places that made expressions difficult. It belonged to someone else, some stranger who had borrowed his features and distorted them beyond recognition. His first thought wasn't about the pain or the recovery ahead. It was his father's voice, clear as if the man were standing in the room. "Don't embarrass us." His father never came to visit. His mother did, hands trembling when she smoothed his hospital sheets, voice cracking when she read psalms and tried to pretend everything would be fine. But his father stayed away, choosing absence over the discomfort of seeing what his son had become. A card arrived weeks later. His father's handwriting was sharp and cold, the letters angular and precise. "Heal up." Don't expect sympathy. Marcus kept it in a drawer. Not because he cherished it, but because it proved something. His father knew. He knew what had happened, and he'd still chosen silence. That knowledge was both a wound and, strangely, a kind of freedom. Recovery became its own battlefield. Physical therapy tore him apart and stitched him back together on a daily schedule. Learning how to eat again without choking. Learning how to shave around scar tissue that pulled and resisted the razor. Learning how to sleep without jolting awake. Convinced he was still burning, still trapped in that Humvee with flames closing in. The therapist told him scars were badges of honor, but those were easy words from people who didn't carry them. Strangers didn't see honor when they looked at Marcus. They saw curiosity, pity, sometimes poorly disguised disgust. Children asked if it hurt, their voices loud and unfiltered. Adults asked nothing at all, just looked away quickly as if his face might be contagious. When the medal came, a bronze star pinned to his chest during a ceremony with cameras clicking and reporters taking notes. They used words like heroic and selfless, but all Marcus could see was the reflection of his scar in the camera lenses. They weren't photographing courage. They were photographing what made him different, what made him newsworthy. Back home, neighbors put up welcome banners and brought casseroles that piled up in his mother's refrigerator. They shook his hand with too much reverence, their grips too firm, their eyes too careful not to stare. But his father remained unchanged. At the dinner table one night, surrounded by family pretending everything was normal, he shook his head once and muttered just loud enough for Marcus to hear. "Should have been more careful," Marcus wanted to shout. Wanted to grab his father by the shoulders and make him understand that he'd dragged 2 men out of fire, that his face burned because he refused to let them die. But the man's disdain drowned everything, left no room for truth or pride or recognition. In Afghanistan, Marcus had learned how quickly life could vanish, how a moment could change everything. Back home, he learned how slowly dignity could be stolen. One comment, one look, one withheld word at a time. But through all of it, one truth smoldered under the ash. He was alive. And the men he'd pulled from that Humvee were alive too, breathing and walking and living because of what he'd done. That mattered more than his father's approval, more than strangers' stares, more than the reflection that greeted him every morning in the mirror. Still, when he looked at himself, he didn't just see survival. He saw his father's prophecy made flesh. Weakness, shame, something to be hidden. He hated that part of him that agreed, that wanted to hide, that felt embarrassed by his own existence. But he also knew he couldn't let his father's voice be the final word. The scar was part of him now, a story carved into skin that couldn't be erased or denied. And someday someone would recognize it, not with pity or curiosity, but with memory. Someone who'd been there, who knew the truth without needing it explained. That moment hadn't come yet, but it would, at a wedding aisle years later, when the man he'd saved would rise trembling to his feet and say aloud what Marcus couldn't say for himself. I know those scars. Coming home was supposed to be a return to normal, a closing of a difficult chapter. Instead, it felt like a translation gone wrong. The words were the same, but the meanings had twisted into something unrecognizable. The streets of his hometown looked smaller, quieter, frozen in time while he'd been moving through fire. But people's eyes looked larger when they landed on him, widening before they could catch themselves. Kids whispered to their parents, tugging sleeves and pointing until they were scolded into silence. Adults smiled too wide, then turned their faces away before that second look could betray what they really thought. At the VA hospital, Marcus learned new routines that became his daily rhythm. Ointments applied in careful layers. Pressure masks worn for hours to help the skin heal properly. Physical therapy designed to stretch tissue that wanted to contract and harden. He learned how to shave carefully around scars, angling the razor to avoid pulling at sensitive skin. He learned to sleep sitting up when the tissue pulled too tight if he lay flat, propped against pillows that never felt quite comfortable. Pain became background noise, something he carried the way others carried car keys or phone numbers. What he couldn't tune out, what demanded his attention every single day, was the pity. Pity wears perfume. It brings casseroles in carefully labeled containers. It fills silences with words like inspirational when it really means tragic, when it means I'm glad that didn't happen to me. Marcus learned to recognize it in the tilt of a head, the soft tone of voice that people used when they thought he might break. His fiancée, though she wasn't his fiancée yet, met him during one of those uncomfortable silences. Her name was Emily. She was a volunteer at the VA hospital, dropping off books for the ward library. Her arms full of paperbacks and hardcovers that smelled of old pages and possibility. She treated him like he wasn't broken. She didn't speak in that careful, soft voice. She asked about his favorite authors, whether he preferred fiction or biography, if he'd read anything good lately. Not about his scars or his service or what had happened to him. Just normal questions that made him feel, for the first time in months, like a person rather than a tragedy. He laughed at something she said, and the laugh came out rusty from disuse. She laughed back, genuine and unafraid. In that laugh was the possibility of a normal life, of conversations that didn't center on pain, of someone who could see past the damage to whatever was underneath. But normal didn't include his father. The man stayed away, made excuses, chose distance over discomfort. When Marcus's mother urged him to visit, to at least stop by and see his son, he said words that cut deeper than any shrapnel. What am I supposed to say? Good job catching fire? He preferred absence to awkwardness, silence to the effort of caring. When Marcus finally walked into his parents' house months later, his father barely looked up from his chair. The television was on, some game show with canned laughter. He glanced at Marcus, eyes skimming over his face without really seeing, then looked back at the screen. You walk funny, he said. That was his welcome home. No hug, no handshake, just an observation delivered like criticism. The neighbors threw Marcus a barbecue. They hung a banner that read Welcome Home Hero in red, white and blue letters. They grilled burgers and brought potato salad and thanked him for his service with hands on their hearts. His father stood in the corner the entire time, beer in hand, lips pressed into a thin line. When people praised Marcus, called him brave, called him a hero, his father corrected them. Not loudly, but loud enough. He should have been more careful. War doesn't excuse mistakes. Marcus kept smiling, kept shaking hands, but inside he shrank. Hero to them, disappointment to his father. Nothing he did would ever bridge that gap. Finding work proved harder than he'd expected. Some employers saw the veteran box checked on applications and called him in, eager to appear patriotic. Most saw his face during the interview and found reasons to end things quickly. Budget constraints. Position filled. We'll be in touch. They were never in touch. He eventually found steady work with a logistics firm, the kind of place that valued discipline and punctuality more than appearance. It wasn't glamorous, but it gave him structure, a reason to get up every morning. Emily kept showing up, coffee on his worst days, the cups warming his hands when everything else felt cold, stubborn smiles on the days he tried to push her away when he told her she didn't have to do this, that she should find someone easier to love. "Scars don't scare me," she said once, sitting across from him in a diner booth, morning light catching in her hair. "Everyone carries them. Yours just happened to be visible." He didn't believe her at first. How could he? He'd spent months watching people flinch, watching them look away. But when she reached across the table and touched his cheek, fingers gentle against damaged skin, and didn't pull away, something inside him began to heal. Not the skin. That was permanent. But something deeper, something no doctor could reach with surgery or medication. When he asked her to marry him kneeling in her living room with a ring he'd saved for months to buy, she didn't hesitate. Her yes was immediate and certain, the loudest word in the room. Louder than all his doubts combined. Planning the wedding became both joy and minefield. Joy because it meant future, possibility, a life beyond pain. Minefield because it meant including his father, or at least deciding whether to include him. The man scoffed when he heard about the engagement. "Who would marry you looking like that?" He muttered the words to Marcus's mother, but loud enough for Marcus to hear from the next room. Not meant for him, but for him all the same. When Emily asked him to walk Marcus down the aisle, tradition dictating that role for family, he refused outright. "It would make me a laughingstock," he said, as if his son's wedding was about his own reputation. People would stare. His absence became its own kind of guest, acknowledged but uninvited. "We don't need him," Emily told Marcus one night, her hand in his, thumb tracing circles over his knuckles. "Family isn't always blood. It's the people who choose to stand with you." She was right. He knew she was right, but part of him still ached, still wished for something different. You can build walls to protect yourself brick by brick, but part of you still wants the one person behind them to try climbing over. As the wedding date drew closer, Marcus tried to imagine the day. He pictured laughter and vows and a first dance that would feel like victory. But the shadow of his father's disapproval always leaned in, whispering that he should be ashamed, that showing his face was an act of defiance rather than celebration. Still, he made a choice. He chose to stand. He chose to let Emily see him fully, scars and all, not just in private but in public, in front of everyone they knew. If she could love him as he was, maybe he could learn to love himself that way too. The morning of the wedding, Marcus stood in front of a mirror in the small room where grooms wait before the ceremony begins. The scar stared back at him, unforgiving in the bright overhead light. He adjusted his tie, smoothed the lapels of his borrowed jacket, forced himself to meet his own eyes. "This is me," he whispered to his reflection. Not an apology, a declaration. At the chapel, family and friends filled the wooden pews. His mother dabbed at her eyes with tissues, already emotional before anything had begun. Emily glowed, radiant and unshaken, her confidence a lighthouse he could navigate toward. For one moment, standing in the doorway and looking down that long center aisle, Marcus believed he could walk forward without looking back, believed the past could stay where it belonged. Then he heard it, his father's voice sharp as broken glass. Disgusting. "How dare you show your face here?" The words cut deeper than any blade ever could. Guests gasped, the sound rippling through the chapel like wind through wheat. Whispers spread from pew to pew. Marcus's knees wobbled, threatening to give out. Emily's hand reached toward him, steady and certain, but shame surged through him like floodwater, drowning everything else. And just when the silence threatened to swallow him whole, when he thought he might actually run, might turn and flee from his own wedding, a chair scraped loudly against the wooden floor. Someone stood at the head table, A Navy SEAL, dress uniform pristine, ribbons marking years of service. Someone Marcus didn't immediately recognize, but whose bearing spoke of battles fought and survived. The man's eyes were fixed on him, wide and trembling. His lips moved around words that seemed to freeze the very air in the chapel. I know those scars. The words hung suspended like smoke after an explosion. Marcus couldn't breathe. His father's sneer was still fresh and raw, but suddenly all eyes had shifted to the man in dress whites standing at the head table, a Navy SEAL. The room recognized his bearing, the straight spine and squared shoulders that only came from years of service and sacrifice. His chest carried more ribbons than Marcus could count quickly, each one marking a story, a mission, a moment when death had come close and been refused. He wasn't looking at Marcus's father, though the man was still standing with fists clenched and face red. He wasn't looking at Emily, beautiful in her wedding dress. He was looking at Marcus with an intensity that felt like being truly seen for the first time in years. His eyes locked onto the scar that Marcus had learned to hate, that his father had just called disgusting, and something in his expression cracked open. He took one deliberate step forward. His shoes made the only sound in the chapel, each footfall distinct and measured. I know those scars, he repeated, his voice firmer now, louder, meant to carry, because I was there. Murmurs rippled through the guests like wind through long grass. Marcus's bride clutched his hand tighter, whispering his name in a voice that asked, "Are you okay?" But he couldn't answer. The SEAL's gaze held him pinned where he stood. Marcus's father tried to reassert control, his voice rising in volume and anger. "Sit down, this is none of your business." But the SEAL didn't move. He squared his shoulders even more, lifted his chin, and spoke with the gravity of someone who had carried the weight of the dead in his memory for years. I know those scars because I was there. Kandahar, the convoy, the fire. His voice broke on the last word. Just for a second, emotion cracking through discipline. Then he continued, stronger. He dragged me out. The room gasped as if a truth had been revealed that changed the shape of everything. Suddenly, Marcus knew. The face was older, weathered by time and experience. The hair was greyer than Marcus remembered. But the eyes. He recognized those eyes. Wide with panic, reflecting flames. He remembered screaming that was muffled by fire and smoke. He remembered arms wrapped under shoulders, pulling with desperate strength. He remembered the way the man's leg had been caught, trapped in twisted metal. This was the man he'd saved. Marcus's knees weakened. He gripped the back of a pew to keep himself upright. The world tilted slightly, reality rearranging itself around this moment. The SEAL kept talking, his voice rising to fill every corner of the chapel. I should be dead. My wife should be a widow. My children should have grown up without a father. Instead, I'm here, alive because this man walked through fire for me. He turned, his eyes cutting into Marcus's father with the precision of someone trained to identify targets. And you? You dare call those scars disgusting? More gasps. Murmurs growing louder. Feet shifting as people turned to look at Marcus's father, whose face had gone pale, caught without an answer for the first time in his life. The officiant, who had frozen mid-prayer with his book half open, lowered it slowly. His mouth was parted in something between shock and awe. Emily squeezed Marcus's hand tighter, tears welling in her eyes but a smile breaking through. Around them, guests were nodding, whispering to each other. Some dabbing at their own eyes with tissues pulled from purses and pockets. The shame that had burned through Marcus just moments before began to shift. It wasn't his to carry. It belonged to his father, the man who had chosen cruelty over pride, judgment over love. The SEAL took another step forward, his voice steady now, no longer trembling. These scars are not shame. They're proof. He let the word hang in the air for a moment, making sure everyone heard it. Proof of sacrifice. Proof of courage. Proof that when bullets were flying and flames were rising, some men run toward the fire instead of away from it. The words struck like hammer blows. Guests began to rise instinctively, as if called to attention, as if the moment demanded they stand in respect. Marcus's father sank back into his seat, all colour drained from his face, silent for the first time. Marcus felt his throat tighten with emotion so strong it threatened to overwhelm him. For years he'd carried those scars like a sentence, like a brand his father had carved deeper with every insult and dismissive comment. But here, in this chapel, in front of everyone who mattered, the truth was finally being spoken aloud. They weren't marks of failure. They were marks of life chosen over death, his survival and the survival of the men he'd pulled from flames. The seal turned back to face Marcus directly. His eyes glistened with unshed tears that he didn't bother to hide. "I owe you everything," he said simply, each word weighted with years of gratitude he'd been carrying. "And today I stand to honor you." The chapel fell into silence again, but this time it wasn't suffocating or shameful. It was reverent, the kind of silence that comes before prayer or blessing. Emily wiped her cheeks, smiling at Marcus like he was the only man in the world, like his scars were medals rather than damage. The officiant nodded slowly, then opened his book again with hands that trembled slightly, moved by what he'd witnessed. "Shall we continue?" he asked softly, voice gentle. Marcus lifted his head. The scar pulled as he allowed himself a small, steady smile. For the first time in years, he wasn't ashamed of his face, of what he'd become, of what he'd survived. He was proud, genuinely deeply proud. His father's disapproval no longer defined him. The truth had been dragged into the open where it couldn't be denied or diminished. And in that chapel, surrounded by family and friends, and the man whose life he'd saved, Marcus finally understood something fundamental. Scars are not what break us. Scars are proof that we were tested and refused to break, that we survived when survival seemed impossible. The ceremony didn't end the way Marcus's father had imagined. He'd probably pictured whispers and shame, his son running from the chapel before vows could be spoken. Instead, he sat frozen, diminished, as the Navy SEAL retold the story with a voice that shook but never wavered. "He dragged me 40 yards under fire," the SEAL said, his eyes never leaving Marcus's face. His face caught the worst of the flames because he was shielding mine with his own body. "I breathed today because he was willing to burn." The crowd stood in collective silence. Some had hands pressed over their mouths, others held tissues to streaming eyes. A few of the older veterans in the room, men who had seen their own wars, snapped to attention without being asked. They saluted Marcus with arms that remembered decades-old discipline, honoring him the way one soldier honors another. Marcus's bride was crying openly now, but not from sadness or pity, from pride, from understanding fully what this man she was marrying had done, who he truly was beneath the scars. Marcus glanced at his father one more time. The man's face had gone pale, his jaw slack, mouth opening and closing without producing sound. For the first time in Marcus's entire life, his father looked small, not physically but in presence, as if the truth pressing down on him from all sides had revealed how little space he actually occupied. Marcus turned back to the SEAL, meeting his eyes with gratitude he couldn't put into words. The man raised his glass, though no one had called for a toast yet. To the man whose scars are not disgrace, but honor. To the soldier who saved lives at the cost of his own comfort. To Marcus. The guests followed instantly, glasses lifting high throughout the chapel. The sound of crystal chiming against crystal filled the room, a chorus that drowned out the awful silence his father had tried to create. When the officiant finally asked for the vows, Marcus's voice came out steady and clear. Emily smiled through her tears as they promised each other more than just love. They promised resilience, forgiveness, partnership forged in the fire of real life, not fairy tales. When the words husband and wife were finally spoken, the applause that erupted shook the rafters. For a moment, Marcus forgot about the scar that pulled at his jaw. He forgot about the years of ridicule and dismissal. He only felt whole, complete, loved exactly as he was. But the night wasn't finished with its revelations. At the reception, people approached one by one. Neighbors who had known him as a boy, uncles who'd served in different wars, even strangers who'd come as guests of Emily's family. They all wanted to shake his hand, to tell him they'd never witnessed anything like what had happened in that chapel. The SEAL stayed close throughout the evening, quiet now as if the act of speaking his truth had exhausted something deep inside him. When Marcus finally found a moment to thank him properly away from the crowd, the man shook his head. "It was time," he said simply. "Past time. I should have found you years ago." Marcus's father slipped out early. No goodbye, no acknowledgement, just a shadow leaving through the side door while music played and people danced. Marcus noticed, but he didn't chase after him. For once, he wasn't the one carrying the weight of his father's absence. The man had chosen to leave, and that choice spoke louder than any words. Later that night, after the cake had been cut and the music had softened to slower songs, the SEAL approached Marcus one final time. He pressed something into his hand without speaking. A photograph, old and creased from being carried. Marcus looked down at the image. It was them, younger versions barely recognizable, covered in dust and smoke in the immediate aftermath of trauma. Marcus's face was already bandaged, white gauze stark against the dirt. The SEAL's arm was draped across Marcus's shoulders, both of them leaning against each other for support. "I kept it all these years," the SEAL explained quietly. "I thought you might want proof. Proof that what you endured saved more than just one life. You gave me back my entire future." Marcus stared at the photograph, at the evidence of what he'd done. Proof. That word again. His father had spent years making him feel like his scars were shameful, something to hide or apologize for. But here was proof they were the opposite. They were the price he'd paid for life, for saving a brother in arms, for choosing courage when fear would have been easier. When Emily and Marcus finally left the reception hall that night, hand in hand, the cool evening air felt like baptism. He didn't flinch when people stared at his scars in the glow of street lamps. For the first time he walked proudly, shoulders back, head high, as if the fire that had once tried to end him had instead marked him as something stronger. War had taken much from him. His father's cruelty had tried to take even more. But standing under the open sky with Emily beside him and the truth finally spoken aloud, Marcus realized neither had won. He was still here, still standing, and standing taller than he'd ever imagined possible. The house was quiet when Marcus finally met his father again, weeks after the wedding. Not in the chapel where truth had been shouted. Not at the reception where shame had been passed from son to father. Just his parents' kitchen, the hum of the old refrigerator filling the silence the way it always had. His mother had asked him to come. She said his father had been sitting in the den for days, barely speaking, nursing something that looked like shame, but he wouldn't name it. Marcus almost didn't go. He'd spent so many years waiting for this man's approval, chasing something that was never offered. Emily touched his arm and said something that changed his mind. Sometimes the scar they can't see is worse than the one you carry. So he went. His father looked smaller in that chair, no longer the man who had barked orders like a drill sergeant at his own dinner table. His eyes flicked up when Marcus entered the kitchen, then dropped again to his hands folded in his lap. For a long time neither of them spoke. Marcus had waited his whole life for his father's words. He could wait a few more minutes. When his father finally spoke, his voice cracked in a way Marcus had never heard before. "I was wrong." Just that. 3 words Marcus had never thought he'd hear. His father cleared his throat, fumbling for more. I thought if I kept you hard, if I never let up, you'd survive anything. I never wanted pity in this house. But He broke off, rubbing his forehead with one hand. "When I saw you standing there in front of everyone, with that SEAL telling the truth, I realized you weren't the weak one. It wasn't poetry. It wasn't eloquent or practiced, but it was real, rough-edged and honest in a way his father had never been before." Marcus let the words sit between them, gave them weight and space. They didn't erase years of cruelty, didn't undo the damage or heal wounds that had gone deep, but they opened a crack in the wall that had stood between them for so long. "I don't need your pity," Marcus said finally, his voice steady. "Never did. What I wanted was respect. What I needed was for you to see me." His father nodded slowly, eyes wet in a way Marcus had never witnessed. "You earned more than respect. You earned something I couldn't give. You earned a life that's yours, built on courage I couldn't understand." They sat in that kitchen for a long time, the silence no longer hostile but not quite comfortable either. It was a beginning, tentative and uncertain. Over the months that followed, his father tried in his own clumsy way. He came to Sunday dinners, quieter than before, listening more than speaking. Sometimes he'd ask about Marcus's work, about Emily, about plans for the future. Once he even asked about the SEAL. Marcus told him the man sends a Christmas card every year, always with a photo of his family. His daughter's middle name is Marcus, named after the soldier who gave her back her father. His father didn't respond with words. He just nodded once and swallowed hard, emotion he couldn't or wouldn't name visible in the working of his jaw. The scar never left Marcus's face. It never faded enough to be forgotten, never became invisible under makeup or surgery. But it stopped feeling like a wound. It stopped being something that defined him as broken or damaged. It became a reminder instead, of fire survived, of life chosen over comfort, of truth that had to be spoken in public before it could be believed in private. On their first anniversary, Marcus and Emily stood in the same chapel where they'd been married. The pews were empty this time, just the two of them, and the echo of what had happened there. Marcus touched the scar gently, fingers tracing the familiar path from cheekbone to jaw. "Thank you," he whispered. Not to the fire, not to the pain, but to the lesson the scar had taught him, the truth it had forced into the light. Because here is what Marcus wants everyone listening to understand. Scars are not disgrace. They are history written on skin, proof that you faced flames and chose to keep walking. His father had mocked his scars until he couldn't anymore, called them shame until another man revealed them as sacrifice. And in that revelation, Marcus had found freedom. If you carry scars, visible or hidden beneath skin where only you can feel them, don't let anyone tell you they make you less. Scars mean you've been tested by fire and refused to burn away completely. Scars mean you've endured when endurance seemed impossible. And sometimes when the moment is right and the truth demands to be heard, your scars are the very thing that will make others rise trembling to honor you. Blood doesn't always salute. Families don't always understand. But honor recognizes honor even across years and distance. If this story reached you, if it stirred something in your chest that had been sleeping, Marcus asks you to pause and reflect. Who has carried scars for you? Who have you dismissed because you only saw the wound and not the warrior beneath it? Share this story if you know someone who needs reminding that survival itself is a form of courage. That standing when you want to run is its own kind of heroism. That the scars we carry, visible or not, are proof we refuse to let fire have the final word. And if you want to hear more truths like this, about resilience and rising and scars transformed into strength, stay and listen. Because together, bearing witness to each other's pain and triumph, we all rise taller,